Thank you. Stanley, thank you so much. Getting that award from you means so much to me. What a thrill for me to be here and to be on the platform with Judge Lippman, who's being honored, and his incredible work, his incredible life. Dr. Debbie Naji, it's so inspiring to hear about the work that you are doing. And I'm grateful to the Interfaith Center of New York for all that you represent in this community, particularly at this time. I feel really privileged to have stood with the condemned, the accused, the convicted, the imprisoned, and the marginalized for 40 years. Because what I've learned is that when you're standing close to people who are disfavored, people who are hated, people who are the target of so much animosity and hatred, sometimes it's possible in that proximity to harness the power of grace and mercy and do something beautiful, do something extraordinary, do something that changes hearts and minds. We're living at a time that's very worrisome. The politics of fear and anger are raging all over the world. And it worries me, because I know that when people allow themselves to be governed by fear and anger, they start to tolerate things they should never tolerate. They start to accept things they should never accept. I've seen it play out all across human history. The worst moment in human history can be best understood when you understand the threat posed by narratives of fear and anger. The Holocaust in Europe in the 20th century was sustained by a narrative of fear and anger that cost the lives of millions of people. There was a genocide in Rwanda just 32 years ago, and narratives of fear and anger spread through that country, and neighbors started slaughtering neighbors. We've seen it in this country in the 1970s. We had politicians from both political major parties, and they started arguing that people who are drug addicted and people who are drug dependent are criminals who should be punished for their addiction and dependency. Our prison population went from 300,000 to nearly 2.3 million by the end of the century now. We shouldn't have been talking in the language of fear and anger. We could have said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent have a health problem and they need a health intervention, but we didn't do that. And now we have record levels of opioid addiction and overdose. We see communities still fractured by addiction and dependency. We see violence, high rates of incarceration, and it's all because we weren't honest about these real problems. And so I stand here on an evening where the politics of fear and anger are raging, which is why I believe that people of faith are called in this moment to be truth tellers. We have an obligation to be witnesses for grace and mercy and truth. We're going to have to do things that the world needs us to do. This is a moment when these forces are pushing. I've seen this play out across American history. We've inherited narratives of racial injustice in this country. And too often, faith communities were silent when they should have been speaking. There were millions of Native people here. And during the 19th century, we allowed policies to displace and to dislocate and cause the death of millions of people. We have a constitution that talks about equality and justice for all, but our political leaders and our policymakers didn't apply those concepts to indigenous peoples. We instead made up a narrative of racial difference. We said, oh no, those Native people, they're savages. They don't get the benefit of our constitutional commitment. And communities of faith didn't say the things that they needed to say. That narrative of racial difference gave rise to 246 years of slavery. And I think the great evil of American slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude. It wasn't the forced labor. I think the true evil of slavery in America was the narrative that was created to justify enslavement, because people who enslaved other people didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or unjust or indecent. They wanted to consider themselves people of faith. And they couldn't do that when they saw mothers being pulled away from their screaming children, knowing that they were going to be sold away and never to see one another. They couldn't do that seeing the brutality and the violence and the cruelty of slavery. So they made up a false narrative. And they created this narrative where they said that black people aren't as good as white people. Black people aren't as human, as evolved, as decent. And that narrative gave rise to all of this horrific violence. And it was so powerful, it actually survived the Civil War. Often argue that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because those ideas of racial hierarchy and bigotry and racial inequality persisted. And that's what gave rise to 100 years of lynching that so traumatized this country. We don't acknowledge it. We don't talk about it. The demographic geography of this country was largely shaped by racial violence. The black people in Harlem, in Brooklyn, in Cleveland, in Detroit, in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Oakland, many of the black people in these communities came to these communities not as immigrants from outside of the country, but as refugees and exiles, internally displaced by racial violence and trauma, and many left lands that they owned. And we have a wealth gap in America today, which is rooted in the forced relocation of people off of their land so they couldn't transfer that wealth to their children and grandchildren. And yes, we had a heroic movement when communities of faith came together and stood up to challenge the architecture of segregation and Jim Crow. It was a powerful moment in American history. It's the moment when you look at our history that we should all be most proud. People of all faiths coming together to do these extraordinary things. And we tore down the architecture of Jim Crow and segregation, but that narrative of racial difference, that narrative of fear and anger still persisted. And so here we are today, and we're combating these things. And it is important that we become committed to truth and justice. After 9/11, when people in this country were dealing with so much fear and anger, we saw the rise of Islamophobia and attacks on Muslim and Arab communities. We've seen this throughout history. We've seen it in places where there's bigotry rising again. And so I am persuaded that this is the moment for faith people to commit to truth-telling. I just came back from Berlin. I was there last week. And when you go to Berlin, you see a city that's reckoned with its history. In Berlin, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and monuments placed all over the city to reckon with the history of the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin. In Germany, as Judge Lippmann and others have explained, you cannot graduate from high school without demonstrating a detailed knowledge of the Holocaust. They don't have people talking about how we can't talk about the Holocaust. That might make some people feel uncomfortable or ashamed. It's a requirement. I didn't see any Adolf Hitler statues in Berlin. There are no monuments to the perpetrators of Nazis. But in this country right now, we are renaming military bases after the very architects of racial injustice, racial hierarchy, and white supremacy. And it goes unaddressed, which is why I believe faith communities must come together and speak. It was people of faith that led the abolitionist movement during the time of enslavement, but many communities of faith stood silently. It was some people of faith who started preaching and working against the violence of mass lynching and racial terror, but some communities were silent. Many people of faith organized and participated in the marches to tear down segregation, but too many communities of faith were silent. We are in a moment where we cannot be silent. And I'm inspired that the Interfaith Center of New York represents that, understands that. We're going to have to lift our voices. We're going to have to stand even when people say sit down. We're going to have to speak even when people say be quiet. I went to Harvard Law School. I don't usually invoke my status at Harvard. I teach at NYU. My dean is here. I've got Judge Lippmann. He's a graduate there. But here recently, I've felt the need to invoke my identification with Harvard University and talk about going to law school there. And on my first day of law school, I am a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children didn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. It was only when lawyers came into our community to make them open up the public schools by enforcing Brown versus Board of Education that I had a chance to go to high school and college. I grew up in a community where most of the adults didn't have high school degrees because there literally were no high schools for black people in our county. But these lawyers came in and they changed things. I went to high school, I went to college. I was a philosophy major in college. I loved college. I was very involved in music, very involved in sports. During my senior year, one day somebody came up to me and said, "Bryan, I hope you know nobody's going to pay you to philosophize when you graduate from college." I panicked because I hadn't really thought what I would do after college. I started looking into graduate programs, political science, literature, history, and to my shock, I learned that to get into graduate school in literature or history, you need to know a lot about literature or history. I found that very intimidating. And to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It became clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You really don't. And so I signed up for that. I got admitted to Harvard Law School, and on my first day of law school, they were trying to make people feel comfortable, so they put us in these small groups. And I went out with my group of about 12 other students. And the group leader asked a very benign question. She said, "Why are you in law school?" And all of my classmates started talking about how they were the son or the daughter or the nephew or the niece or the grandson or the granddaughter of a lawyer. And after the fifth person invoked these familial connections, I started squirming because I knew I wasn't related to any lawyers. After the sixth or seventh person made these family connections, I had this realization that hadn't even occurred to me until that moment. And what I realized is that not only was I not related to a lawyer, I realized I'd never even met a lawyer. By the time they got to me, I felt so diminished, I didn't answer the question honestly. I told a joke, I lied, I did something. I just wanted to get out of there. And when I left that space, I called my mom and said, "Mom, I don't think I belong in this law school." And my mom said, "What are you talking about? You belong wherever you go. You're the smartest person in the world. You can do anything you want to do." Then my mother said, "Now you go back and get those kids together and you tell them why you're really in that law school." And I felt better after talking to my mom, but I realized I couldn't actually organize a meeting of these students. That would be too awkward. But 2 weeks into my law school career, I still felt unsettled. I still felt out of place. And I finally did what my mom told me to do, and I tried to find the students in my group. And I asked them if I could just meet with them. It was kind of awkward, but I got a number of them together, and I said, on the first day of law school, I wasn't honest. I didn't tell you why I'm really in law school because I was a little bit embarrassed that I'm not related to any lawyers and I've never met a lawyer. I said, but I have to tell you why I'm in law school. And I told them that I'm in this law school because my great-grandfather was enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia. And even though he was enslaved, and even though it was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read or write, my great-grandfather risked his life to learn to read because he had a hope of freedom so powerful, so great, he wanted to be ready when freedom came. It was the 1850s. He couldn't know that a civil war was coming in a decade, but he risked his life to learn to read. And after emancipation, my grandmother said that once a week, my great-grandfather would stand on the porch of their home and he would read the newspaper to formerly enslaved people who didn't know how to read. And he wanted them to know what was going on. And my grandmother told me that she was so proud of her father because he knew how to read, and she would push her siblings aside when he started reading. And she told me she would wrap her arms around his legs as he started to read because she wanted to learn to read. And she told me that she thought you learned to read by touching somebody while they read. He figured out what she was doing. He said, "No, Victoria, that's not how you learn to read. I'm going to teach you how to read." And he taught her to read. And my grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life. She cleaned other people's homes. She lived into her 90s, but my grandmother was a reader. She had 10 children. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids, and she was committed to reading and the truth that education creates. I'd go visit my grandmother, and even on cold days, when I got to her house, she would come out on the porch and she'd have a stack of books. You'd have to read something before my grandmother would let you in the house, and she would give you a grade on your reading. I didn't grow up in a hopeful place. I grew up in a place where there was a lot of poverty, a lot of despair. You didn't see a lot outside the door. But when I was a little boy, my mother went into debt, and she bought us the World Book Encyclopedia. And we had those books in our house. And I told my classmates at Harvard, I've never met a lawyer. I'm not related to a lawyer, but I read all about the lawyers in the World Book Encyclopedia. And I didn't understand it as a child because, you know, you're 10 and Christmas comes along and your friends are outside. You go out there and they say, well, I got a basketball. I got a bicycle. I got a baseball. And I'd have to say, well, I got volume G of the World Book Encyclopedia. But on that day at Harvard, I realized something I hadn't realized before, which was that I was being lifted up by generations of people who had a hope so powerful that they would not be quiet, they would not sit down. And when I started to feel the generations of enslaved people who were lifting me up, when I started to feel the generations of those who escaped and dealt with racial terror in this country, those who were segregated, those who were excluded, those who were humiliated by Jim Crow, I realized that maybe I had something that my classmates might not have. I started to believe I could do anything to advance justice and law that God calls me to do. And so in this moment, I am here because I believe I have been called as we all have been called. The prophet Micah says in chapter 6 that God requires that we do justice, that we love mercy, that we walk humbly with him. And in this moment of fear and anger, I hope we become hopeful, faithful people,
People who recognize that justice is not an option, it is a requirement. Mercy is not an option, it is a requirement. Love is not an option, it is a requirement. I know that that is the purpose and mission of the Interfaith Center of New York, and I'm honored to be associated with all of you who are doing this important work, and I want to thank you for this recognition, thank you for this acknowledgement, and extend my appreciation to you. I'm going back to Montgomery. I want all of you to come and visit us at our sites. I am persuaded that I owe truth-telling to the 10 million black people who were enslaved in this country. It is the justice we owe them for the immeasurable suffering and the constant sorrow of slavery. When we tell people to not understand history, we're doing something that's not only dishonest, we're doing something that is unjust. And that is true for the true history of our country, the true history that I think can lift us up. So thank you for this recognition, thank you for this award, and thank you for all the work you do at the Interfaith Center of New York.